What's going on, guys? This is VinylicPuma, back with a bit of an experimental video for you guys, and today I figured I'd rank all of the boss battles in the newly released Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now before we start, we should go over the criteria. All bosses that display a health bar under their name during your encounter with them will be included, with the exception of most Haxion Brood bosses, since most encounters with these tend to be randomly generated. Also, bosses will be ranked from easiest to hardest. There will be spoilers, and all gameplay shown in this video will be on Jedi Master difficulty if you're curious. And of course, it's highly important that you be sure to smash like on this video to help prevent stray blaster bolts. And failing that, just be sure to smash like on this video if your favorite boss ranked high up in this particular video. Otherwise, guys, we've got 13 of these bosses to go through, and we'll start with what I think is the easiest, and that is the security droid. If you ask me, this is the easiest boss in the entire game. Granted, it's not super easy during the first encounter like it is in the later parts of the game, where you can chop security droids apart like a warm knife through butter, but I do think this boss fight is pretty easy. This is mainly because the attacks the security droid does are pretty obvious and well telegraphed, and you can usually just step out of the way while you wait for it to stop attacking, and then swing at it a couple of times with your lightsaber. You may even find that many of the unblockable types of attacks are in a similar vein as well, since like the normal attacks, all are pretty well telegraphed and easily dodgeable. I suspect you'll agree, but I'd say this particular boss is a pushover. You may have a little difficulty with these at first, provided they appear in groups with other enemies, but after that, and in the grander scheme of things, these things are pretty easy and won't cause you that much trouble. Another type of boss that's a pushover is Atticus Rex and the Haxion Brood type bounty hunters. To distinguish between these two, Atticus Rex appears to be a guaranteed encounter as you're leaving Zephos for the second time, while the Haxion Brood bounty hunter is the more generic version of this same enemy. The former, Atticus, usually appears alone as a part of the story, while the latter can appear with one of the other Haxion Brood type bounty hunter bosses as part of a random boss battle. When you fight either outside of the specific story encounter where Atticus captures you, they're generally pretty easy to take down on their own. Without abilities, and like I am here with Atticus Rex, you can usually just wait for them to land and then smack them with your lightsaber until they go down. In groups, and provided you have a lot of abilities, I'd recommend you focus on taking them out first and then throw your lightsaber at them. These bounty hunters don't usually have a way to really block your attacks, so as long as you consistently attack them, they should go down pretty easily. Overall though, the Haxion Brood bounty hunters are usually pretty easy, and Atticus Rex is probably easier than many of the other random mob enemies you fight before you actually take him on. Just worry about these guys when they're in groups, as that's really when they can give you a hard time. But let's go on to the next boss, which is the ALBINO WYYYSCHOKK. So the giant spiders you can encounter on Kashyyyk are pretty intimidating at first, especially in groups, as it can be difficult to juggle 2 or 3 of them at once thanks to their high health and relatively high damage attacks. The albino variant, however, isn't too terrible in comparison. Granted, it's got more health and usually hits a bit harder than the standard WYYYSCHOKK, but in the grander scheme of things, I didn't feel like this one was really that bad. After all, it's kind of like fighting a regular WYYYSCHOKK one-on-one, which is something you should usually strive to do anyway, since it makes fighting them a heck of a lot easier. Perhaps the bigger health bar makes things feel a little more dramatic or whatever, but if you're already good at singling out, separating, and defeating regular spiders in groups of 2 or more, I think you'll find that's a lot harder than taking on this particular boss. You also have to consider that this fight is optional. You can always come back here decked out with the best abilities and skills, which will make this fight even easier. So again, the big white spider isn't so tough. Speaking of tough, we have something that's not quite as tough as it looks, and that's the ATST. In my mind, the ATST is the first real boss fight you could take on, and while some of the footage I'm showing here may indicate otherwise, this particular boss fight isn't really all that difficult. After all, you should have force push at this point, which should allow you to knock some of the landmines and rockets that the ATST fires back at it, dealing damage. And assuming you weren't aware of that going in, you can sort of just do what I'm doing here in the gameplay, where I deflect most of the blaster bolts back, which will whittle the ATST's health down as well. To be honest, I thought this boss would be a lot more intimidating than it actually is. After all, it's like a huge tank is coming after you, but really, I don't think this boss fight is really super challenging or anything. Most of the attacks are fairly well telegraphed, and you can either choose to counter them or just dodge them completely. Maybe if you're having a hard time deflecting blaster bolts back at enemies, you may have some trouble here, but as long as you remember to use Force Push, I think you'll agree this fight is pretty easy. And now we arrive at the Alpha Death Claw. Sorry, wrong franchise, it's actually the NYDAK Alpha, but it reminds me of the Death Claws from Fallout. Smash like for Fallout reference, by the way. Maybe it's because I got lucky or learned some of the NYDAK's fighting patterns, but I don't think the NYDAK Alpha is really that hard. As far as I could tell, a lot of his attacks are pretty similar to a regular NYDAK, which are hard to predict at first, but you get more used to over time. And by the time you get to the NYDAK Alpha, you're already pretty accustomed to how to fight these types of enemies, which makes the NYDAK Alpha a bit easier despite its more intimidating status. It's possible you may have a different experience and a lot more trouble with this boss than I did, but I think due to the fact that you usually encounter this boss really late in the game, and by that point you likely have really great abilities, I don't think you'll find that this boss is too challenging. It might be one thing if you encounter this boss really early, say in Chapter 2 or 3, but since you don't, again, I don't think you'll really have too many problems here. Just watch out for that last attack before it finally goes down. This brings us to our final boss type that's not really too difficult and I would consider to be part of the easier tier, and that's going to be the Haxion Brood Bounty Droid. Like other Haxion Brood type bosses, these guys seem to be able to come with a variety of names. As you can see from the gameplay, I'm fighting Clunk here, though, and depending on where you are and what planet you're on, the Haxion Brood droid you encounter may have a different name. Compared to the other two Haxion Brood type bosses, I'd say this one is roughly in the middle. I think it's stronger and more difficult than the Bounty Hunter, but unlike the other Haxion Brood boss that we'll be discussing shortly, you don't really have to worry all that much about flash grenades and other similar types of pesky attacks with the droid. You do have to worry about these charging attacks, which are pretty annoying, but beyond that, you could just spam lightsaber throw and these things will go down surprisingly quickly. Overall, I think you'll agree these aren't too terrible. You may have some issues from time to time when they appear with other Haxion Brood type bosses, but one-on-one, these guys are pretty easy to take down. And now we have the first boss that I would actually consider to be kind of difficult, and that is the RABID JOTAZ. While this boss wouldn't really be that hard normally, I think what makes the RABID JOTAZ relatively difficult mainly comes down to the environment in which you encounter it. As you may have noticed, you're in a small cylindrical room with a beam in the middle, and this can really limit your movement quite a bit. For other bosses, you can usually dodge and run to the sides, while for this boss, you're usually going to end up dodging backwards, and the RABID JOTAZ can pretty easily cover that distance. That said though, and depending on when you come here and start exploring the ship wreckage on Zephos, there's a good chance this fight could end up being a lot easier. Regular JOTAZ can be brought down pretty easily once you have some of the better skills in the game, and I suspect that the RABID JOTAZ isn't much different. Since I took him on earlier in this footage, I had a bit of trouble with this boss, but your experience could be a lot different, especially if you decide to take him on later. Now for this next one, which is OGGDO BOGDO. It's a good thing this boss is optional, as I think he is the hardest of the creature bosses you can encounter, especially for the early game where you have low health and weaker lightsaber abilities. Granted, you can always come back later like I've done here, but even then I felt like this thing was pretty difficult. A lot of this I think has to do with the fact that he's got quite a bit of health, and according to the game's tactical guide, he is lightsaber resistant, meaning your attacks will deal less damage to him than they would to regular, non-resistant enemies. On top of that, and maybe it's just me, but it seems like BOGDO just has a lot of unblockable attacks. Whether it's the charged bite, the belly flop, or the tongue-based attack, you have to do a lot of dodging, and when it comes to that charged bite attack in particular, it's surprisingly fast, and it is probable that you don't successfully dodge. Again, it's really good this boss is optional, because I couldn't imagine taking this one on at the very beginning of the game and being super successful. I'm sure someone has done that successfully, but I'd recommend you come here later on when you have better abilities. And now we arrive at our top 5 hardest bosses in Jedi Fallen Order. And to kick things off, we'll discuss the Haxion Brood Commandos. Much like their Haxion Brood counterparts, these can be a real pain when and if they're encountered in groups. In my experience, I managed to encounter 2 of these during my visit to Kashyyyk, and as you could see from some of the gameplay, it was a pretty tough fight at that time. A lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that these commandos can throw grenades that blind you, in addition to this shield charging attack that's unblockable and is harder to dodge than you might think. If you encounter 2 of these like I did, be prepared to have both of them blind you constantly, or one blind you while the other one charges with their shield, taking a huge chunk out of your health bar. Like most Haxion Brood though, these guys aren't too tough one-on-one, and hence, this is a big part of why I decided to rank this one a little bit lower. By the time you start to get some of the better abilities like lightsaber throw, you can easily take out huge chunks of these things' health bars due to the fact that they can't block your lightsaber. And at that point, you just have to watch out for this wrist repulsor type attack they have, which can knock you back if you're a little too aggressive. If you ever find you're fighting 2 of these, try to see if you can knock one off the ledge. If you can't do that though, be prepared for a tough fight. For our number 4 entry, we have something that I think arguably could have been in the 5th place spot, and that's the 9th Sister. Despite her ominous appearance, higher difficulty, and status as one of the game's major bosses, I didn't have too much trouble with the 9th Sister. A lot of this, I think, comes down to the fact that her attacks are relatively slow, and this is especially notable in Phase 1, where she's using a single-bladed lightsaber. All you have to do is kind of step back or block, and you probably won't have many issues here. Where I do think people could have trouble is with Phase 2, which is where the 9th Sister starts using a double-bladed lightsaber. A lot of the attacks here are noticeably faster, and some of the unblockable windmill-style lightsaber attacks in addition to the charging attacks are harder to dodge. Add on the fact that she can block many of your lightsaber attacks already, and this fight will be a bit tougher than some of the others. If you ask me, I think you may have more trouble with 2 Haxion Brood commandos depending on your crop of abilities and skills. But the 9th Sister is no pushover either, and you'll certainly want to be on your toes when you take her on. And for the bronze, we have the God of War-like boss, which is GORGARA. Though the second encounter with this boss is pretty cool and feels a lot like God of War, I'm mainly going to be discussing the first encounter here. After all, it's more like a conventional boss fight, while the second encounter is more of a QTE fest. Typically, GORGARA is fought in 2 phases. Phase 1 mostly consists of him being on the ground and him attacking you with a number of unblockable but fairly easy to dodge attacks. Phase 2, on the other hand, involves more air-based attacks, with one involving this quasi-beam attack, another being this charging attack, and another being this giant wave attack you have to jump over to avoid. Of the 2 phases, Phase 1 isn't really that difficult, but Phase 2 can really present some problems. Especially the first go-around, as this is where I initially died due to not really knowing the pattern. Once you are a little more familiar with some of the dodges for Phase 2, GORGARA gets a lot easier, as you can usually run away from the beam, you can turn off auto-target and run out of the way of the charge attacks, and then of course you can just jump over those wave attacks. As far as major bosses go though, I'd say this one can be fairly tough. Granted, GORGARA I don't think is quite as hard as some of the other endgame bosses, but just don't underestimate him. In second place, and not to be confused with that certain hooded stranger from Diablo 2, we have TARON MALICOS. Of the lightsaber-based bosses, TARON is pretty tough. I'm not sure if it's the dual lightsabers or that he's a relatively fast attacker, but I suspect you'll likely have quite a bit of trouble with him, especially when compared to the 9th Sister, who I think is relatively easy to take on by comparison. Like other bosses, TARON MALICOS has 2 phases. During Phase 1, you're mostly just taking him on by yourself, and during this phase, he can pretty easily block most of your attacks, in addition to doing some really crazy stuff like throw one lightsaber up in the air that homes in on you, while attacking you with the other. During Phase 2, you have the benefit of Merrin occasionally joining in as a support. However, TARON steps up a lot of his attacks as well. He can quickly cover the distance between you and him with his leaping attacks. He gains the ability to throw rocks at you, which can't be blocked, and rather than throw just one lightsaber, he starts to throw both. It's a good thing that Marion will help you during this phase, since she will take some of the pressure off you and make the fight a little bit easier, but still, this fight is pretty hard. In the end, and while difficult, I do think TARON MALICOS is one of the more fun bosses to take on. Dathomir, along with this battle, gives me some nostalgia for the Korriban Sith Academy from the original Knights of the Old Republic. So, if you're a fan of KOTOR, definitely be sure to smash like on this video. And finally, and for the boss you totally didn't expect, we have the second sister. So the second sister is encountered about 4 times throughout the game, though the most notable encounters in my mind are the second encounter just before you enter the Tomb of Mictral on Zephos, and then there's the 4th and final encounter, which is where she is the final boss. Of these 2 encounters though, I'd say the final boss battle is probably the hardest, since in Phase 2, she manages to combine these annoying wave attacks, quasi-force choke combos, and randomly spawning probe droids that you'll all have to juggle. I could be wrong on this, but I think either she or the probe droid can also deploy flash grenades, where if you end up in one of those force choke combos, say goodbye to half or more of your total health. As for the second encounter with her on Zephos, I think that one is actually a bit easier, despite the fact that you're far weaker and less deadly at that point of the game. Don't get me wrong, it's still kinda hard since she can just block a bunch of your attacks and hit you pretty hard, but as long as you're careful and whittle her HP down, she'll eventually just end the fight so you can continue the story. In general though, the second sister is always pretty hard. She's probably most difficult at the very end of the game due to her cheap tactics, but she can be pretty stressful during the second encounter as well, especially if you don't have a lot of stims. Otherwise guys, thank you all for watching, and I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely be sure to smash like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload my next video, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.